Hello, and welcome to another edition of F&R Ask the Expert. Today, we're talking all about trees, specifically trees in the urban or unnatural environment. We're going to talk about how to select the right tree for your landscape. We're going to talk about how to avoid planting invasive species, which none of us want in our landscapes, no matter how pretty they may be. How to properly plant your trees and how to care for them to, not waste all your efforts. So we're joined today by Purdue Extension urban forestry expert, Lindsey Purcell. So our setup is going to be a little bit different today. We're going to have some videos mixed in here with our live stuff. So, but please leave your questions in the comments section on Facebook, and we will get to those after each segment. We're going to have 3 specific segments, and then we'll have questions after each. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Lindsey, and he's going to give us a quick rundown of what to expect today. And then we're going to get things rolling with the first video.
Awesome. Can you hear me, Wendy?
Yep, we're good.
All right, great. Well, welcome. It's that time of year where we're thinking about planting, selecting, and taking care of our trees. So why not talk a little bit about that process? So what I've created is a video that's been pre-recorded just in case we have technical issues. But I've created a short video, and all you really need to know about tree planting in under an hour. That starts with the selection process, which is often overlooked. We basically choose trees based on appearance, which there's a little more to it than that. But also we're going to talk about selection, planting, and then what to do with your tree after you planted it. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can you see it, Wendy? Tree selection impacts the success of any tree planting. Matching the site with the species is a critical step in the tree planting protocol. It will affect the long-term benefits and inputs of the tree for the life of the tree. Hi, I'm Lindsey Purcell, Urban Forestry Specialist at Purdue University in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And in this webinar, I'm going to provide a quick look at tree selection, placement, and planting, all in under an hour. Picking and planting a tree is an important responsibility and a great example of environmental stewardship. However, there's one step in the process, placement, which can impact the sustainability and success of the tree on that site. Now, let's take a look at this 3-step process and some of the considerations that go into picking, placing, and planting a tree, with a few maintenance tips as well. So let's talk about the benefits of trees. This is one of the most important things we need to consider when we're talking about trees, especially in our urban forest, which includes any residential area, including your home. Now, Indiana ranks 46 out of 50 states in air and water quality, according to recent research. And all of these things that are listed are just a few of those many benefits, or what we call ecosystem services that tree provides. Now, when we look at planting a tree, we want to look at our site. And one of the first things we look at is soil pH. Now, in central Indiana, we have oftentimes clay soils with typically very high pH. I've seen pH ranges in anywhere from 7.5 to up to 8.75. And that's really high for a lot of plants and what they prefer. Most trees prefer to be in the neutral zone or slightly acidic to get the best growth, color, and flowering potential. Soil type and texture are very important as well. Typically, we have a combination of sand, silt, and clay. However, in most parts of Indiana, especially in central Indiana, we tend to, as I mentioned earlier, have a more clay situation. And one of the things that this impacts is drainage, and also its water holding capacity as well. Drainage is very important. Nothing likes wet feet. And if water doesn't drain or evacuate the root system in a fairly quick time frame, then we can anticipate some problems as far as root rots and fungal organisms which are going to attack the tree. Now, one of the things I like to do is to do a drainage test, and That's simply just digging a hole similar to what your planting pit would be for your tree that you're installing, and just fill it with water and see how long it takes for that water to drain from that planting site. Now in this particular picture, this was an urban area in Lafayette, and this water had been in this planting pit for almost 3 days. So obviously we had to make some serious considerations and decisions on how we may alter the planting site, or we may just not be able to put a tree in there, as it will not be a sustainable location for that tree. Now, if the soil allows the water to drain away in 4 to 6 hours or even 8-hour time frame, you may be all right there as far as appropriate drainage for that tree selection. So in this video, this shows a little example of obviously a tree in trouble, and when I started looking at it with a soil probe, you can see it's extremely wet. You can see the water just rolling out of that soil. And again, this has been sitting in that water for quite a long time, and as a result, we often see problems with the roots, which express symptoms in the top part of the tree in the form, oftentimes, it looks very similar to drought conditions. We'll often see chlorotic leaves or needles and then browning. But get in there and check the soil before you water it, or to determine if it needs a supplemental irrigation, to make sure that you're doing the right thing as far as those cultural practices go. Infrastructure conflicts is another one. Now, when we're planting, is perhaps in the rights of way of your community or of your subdivision, we want to make sure that we don't create problems. Making sure that we don't plant too close to the building or under power lines. Make sure that you're aware of what's going on with above ground and below ground utilities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, make sure when you're planting near a street that you're not creating a line of sight issue as well, which could be a problem for pedestrians and vehicles. I'm going to take a look at some examples of proper placement, both with some images that I've collected over the years, and also I'm going to show a little short segment of video giving some examples of some tree placement and plantings in a couple of neighborhoods near where I live. Now, this was an example of some beautiful star magnolias that were planted several years ago. Great place for them, no windows, and obviously the trees help to bring the scale of the building down. But problem is they're just a little too close, and the tree owner complained of a potential issue with the foundation. When I laid my my hand down there and measured it, it's only about 11 inches from the foundation there. So obviously a little too close. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do there to improve that situation except remove and replant with a suitable species, but far enough away that for anticipation of that mature growth. This is another one. This on a commercial site. You can see on the left there, we have a tulip poplar, which is the Indiana state tree. What do we know about these types of trees? They get very big. When I measured from the trunk to the corner of the building, it was approximately 8 feet. So obviously this tree is going to outgrow this space in a few years, which is going to require a lot of maintenance inputs as far as pruning. And unfortunately, once that tree gets to a sustainable size and one that's providing those all-important ecosystem services, well, the tree's probably going to have to be pruned severely or even removed, which is unfortunate as far as creating a more sustainable tree planting. My neighbor Bob's one of my favorite ones. He knew that I was a tree guy. I was in my garage working on my bicycle, and he came over and grabbed me and said, "Hey, look what I did here. I planted a tree." I'm like, "All right, Bob, nice job. What do you got there?" "I got a Colorado spruce. Looks like a little Christmas tree. My wife and the grandkids are going to decorate it for Christmas, and it's going to be great as they grow up." I said, "Yeah." He said, "It's going to be awesome. How big does that tree get?" Bob said he didn't really know. but he thought it was a good location there. Well, I stepped off from the tree to the corner of his garage, and it was one step and my nose was in the bricks. So I said, well, Bob, you might want to take a look at and investigate how big that tree gets. An example is right across the street here, which it's probably going to outgrow that space pretty big and pretty soon and cause some issues. Well, Bob wasn't so happy with me, but he was at least smart enough to know that he needed to move the plant or the tree in order to keep it alive and keep it in a sustainable location. So he did replant in the backyard. So again, proper placement is so important for the future of that tree. So let's take a look at a few more here in this next video segment, and we'll talk about tree placement for the future. Placement of that tree is a critical component of the tree installation process, making sure that we have plenty of room between the tree and any neighboring structures such as a home or garage or any other structure. Adequate space allows for open growth of the canopy so that we receive full benefits, including shade and cooling of the home, as well as framing and other important design attributes. A tree planted too close will create a lot of maintenance nightmares and a lot of inputs by the tree owner. For example, this beautiful swamp white oak is only about 11 feet from the front of the house. And as the tree expands and grows and matures, it's going to require a lot of pruning and perhaps removal later on. The neighboring maple is certainly far enough away from its neighboring tree, but also more importantly, it's far enough away from the front of the home in order to allow full expansion of that crown with minimal infrastructure conflicts. Here's a tree that's been planted about 25 years and obviously far enough away from the home that it allows full expansion of that crown so that it provides some wonderful benefits as far as shading and cooling the home with no infrastructure conflicts. So be sure and consider mature tree size when you're placing those trees. Another very important thing that impacts tree plantings as well is utility considerations. We need to look above ground and below ground in order to make sure that we're not creating any type of conflicts there or a very serious risk and safety consideration as well. Underground, there's a lot going on, and oftentimes we think we know what is underground, especially in and around our property. So be sure to call 811 in order to determine where your utilities are. The locations typically occur within 48 hours. Oftentimes, especially in urban areas, there are utility easements and rights of way that require special permission in order to plant a tree. And that's not necessarily to prevent you from installing a new tree near your house, but making sure that you install it in a safe, sustainable location for the future. Now let's take a look at plant selection at the nursery. Now the old adage applies to trees as well. You get what you pay for, and that certainly goes for trees. In order to get a quality tree, we want to make sure we go to a reputable source. A dedicated nursery or garden center is often the best place to look for quality trees. What we want to look for is good branch structure and a good branch system. As you see down there on the bottom, you see the bald and burlap trees, and directly above that you see the close-up of the stems. We want to make sure that we don't have multiple leader systems or codominant stems. We also want to inspect the root system and the media to make sure that we don't have root-bound plants, especially when buying smooth wall containered plants. Oftentimes the trees are even stressed before you purchase them, especially when you buy them at the big box stores. As you see on the left there, they're on sale for a reason, and most likely they've been there since early spring, and they've been sitting on that hot concrete in those black smooth wall containers, generating a lot of heat. Who knows if they've got any water or any supplemental nutrition in that holding process. So the tree's stressed before you even get it. We want to make sure we check for those signs of stress by looking and see if the leaves are yellowed, or if there's some brown necrotic areas on the leaf margins, which typically indicates that the trees have been dry. So we want to just make sure that we inspect the tree carefully, make sure we're getting a good healthy tree before we take it home and plant it. There's some resources available to you from the Purdue Education Store. Tree selection, I provided some lists of both the utility-friendly trees and also some Indiana native trees that are very popular and typically available. It's on FNR 531W. It's a free download from the Purdue Education Store, and much of what I talked about already for tree selection is included in this particular publication. So I urge you to download that and take a look at it for a little more details and information on the tree selection process. So I was just curious to see if there was any questions as far as tree selection goes as we move through the process of installing our tree.
Lindsey, talk us through a little bit of the invasive species. One thing we didn't mention, we want people to be planting native species, and there might be some out there that are pretty, but not necessarily good for our environment and for the habitat locally. What can you talk to us about a little bit about invasives versus the positives of planting native species?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion regarding invasive species, especially when we look at all the ornamental pears that have escaped our landscapes as they have reverted back to their natural state, genetic state, and created a lot of areas that are just clustered and packed full of those ornamental pears in these fallow and open fields. And so that led to a major movement towards choosing native trees. Well, there's nothing native about the urban environment. And so it's not necessarily choosing native trees. There are some cultivated varieties of trees that have been bred to actually sustain themselves in the often hostile environment of the built environment that around homes, urban areas, suburban areas. So the key thing in selection is making sure you choose something that's not known to be invasive. And if there's some information on alternatives to invasives on the Purdue Education Store that are available to help you in that selection process. Some common invasive plants that we often see in the landscape are ornamental pears, which typically they're called Bradford pears or Callery pears. Also barberries, winged euonymus or burning bush, euonymus. Those are common plants, landscape plants, both trees and shrubs that we often find in native areas, natural areas like our woodlots and forests that shouldn't be there, and that's because they have become invasive.
So burning bush, some of these really pretty ones, the problem is they spread, correct?
Right. Yeah, they're usually the result of prolific seed production, and as a result, they become a food source for birds. And then birds are some of our best tree planters, but sometimes they get carried away.
And so just once again, if you're watching on Facebook Live and you have questions for Lindsey, go ahead and put those in the comment section. I'm going to put some resources on how to find out if a plant is invasive or not before you do plant it, and some of those alternatives that Lindsey mentioned. And with that said, go ahead and put those in the comment section, and we're going to move forward with, once you pick your tree, what next?
All right, here we go. All right, now we've talked about choosing a tree. Now we've picked what we want, thinking about all of those things that we need to consider on our site, pH, soil type, soil texture, also placement, as far as how far to put it away from the house or the garage or perhaps a corner, wherever your place is. So we've got all those things determined and we picked the right tree. So now let's look at how to plant that tree and get it in its new home, doing it the right way. All right, as far as planting pit size, really it depends. A lot of it has to do with what available space that you have. Now, a lot of literature and even other university publications often say 2 to 3 times the size of your planting ball. Well, oftentimes we don't have that much of space available, nor do we actually need to. Planting with size just depends on what you have available and also the type of soil. So for example, if you have, as you see in the middle picture there, a 2-foot ball across, follow what is considered the guidelines for planting 2 to 3 times the size. Let's say we're going to go the max and give the tree all it can. Well, that would mean a 2-foot ball would require a 6-foot wide hole. We often just don't have that. So really, planting width is depending on that available space and soil texture, and oftentimes the planting pit is only as wide as the situation or the space allows. So if you can get at least 6 inches to a foot wider than the actual ball, typically you will have a successful tree planting. Now, width is one thing because oftentimes that's dictated by what's around the tree. Now, depth, that's the real critical factor as far as success for tree planting. One of the things we want to make sure that we identify is what we call the root flare. And this is typically where the trunk actually comes out and forms a flare that you see here in the diagram. And this is usually the top part of the root system and the root ball. This is where we want to make sure that we install the tree even with the grade or ground level where your tree is going to be planted. So oftentimes in the nursery, they are planted too deep as part of the nursery production process. And it's important for us to locate that or find it to make sure that we plant the tree at the proper grade. Excessive planting depth is one of the greatest problems that we have as far as tree mortality 5, 10, and even 15 years down the road. Oftentimes I've seen where trees have just started declining and eventually die, and usually it's a result of excessive planting depth. This is what your tree should look like if you suspect that the root flare, or what we call oftentimes the root collar, is buried. So it doesn't hurt to disturb that root system and the soil above the root flare in order to find that, because that's what's going to make sure that that tree survives in its new home at the proper depth. So if we watch this video, this is a tree that we're planting on campus. This one actually isn't too deep. Just take a soil knife or a trowel and start digging around. We want to make sure that we don't damage that bark and cambium layer, which is the transportation system for food and water for the tree. So what we want to do is just remove the excess soil to find the lateral roots, and then make sure that that soil level and the root and the trunk collar is visible. And that would be our established grade. As I mentioned, this one isn't too bad. Now we're ready to install our plant. Now with balled and burlap plants, there's some special considerations besides not only finding the root flare, but also with the transportation and production materials. First of all, we want to make sure that we always handle the plants by the root ball, not by the trunk. Oftentimes you'll see people carrying these trees by the trunk in order to make it a little more convenient and easier on their back. However, we want to make sure that we don't loosen that trunk soil root interaction where it becomes wobbly in that root ball. We want to make sure that we pick it up from the ball and move it to our planting location. Also make sure that you cut and remove any twine or rope that is found around the trunk, and especially down there at the root collar. Current research supports that you cut and remove the upper 1/2 of the wire and the basket, and also the upper half of the burlap material. If we remove the entire basket and burlap, we run the risk of losing the entire root ball, which leaves us planting a bare root tree, which can be a little bit dangerous and risky, especially if the tree is fully leafed out. As I mentioned earlier, excessive plant depth is one of the leading killers of trees, as you can see on this maple, which was planted about 3 years before we noticed the decline of the tree. Well, as you can see, a closer examination here reveals that there really isn't any root collar. In fact, it looks like sort of a pencil or a telephone pole going into the ground, if you will. And so as a result, most likely it's been planted too deep. So I take my soil knife or trowel and start digging around and find that, yeah, it's been planted excessively deep. To the point that it's about 6 to 8 inches. My soil knife is actually 8 inches long, and you can see where the wetness on the trunk is, which causes a fungal rot that removes that trunk material and the vascular system and causes decay. So this is what we typically find when trees have been planted too deep. So in the upper right corner, that's the telltale sign. If you don't see the root flare, then most likely the tree's been installed too deep, and you'll need to effect some type of mitigation efforts there, or again, in the planting process, just make sure that you find that root flare. Even as little as 3 to 4 inches can cause a problem, but this is just a little advertisement that I put out. 6 inches too deep, might as well be 6 feet under, because it's not if it kills the tree, it will kill the tree eventually. Now let's take a look at container grown plants. This is what we typically see in nurseries and garden centers. They do have some distinct advantages. They're available for year-round planting, and oftentimes they're much more lightweight and easier to handle than balled and burlapped nursery material. Some disadvantages that require some special planting techniques include the fact that they're grown in these smooth-walled containers, typically from seed on up to the time that you purchase them. So oftentimes they're root-bound in those pots. And this is what creates a situation called SGRs, as we use the acronym in the industry, which represents stem girdling roots. And those will cause long-term problems that will eventually kill the tree as well, typically in that 10 to 15 year range, if not sooner. And we're going to talk about how to mitigate that issue during the planting process. Another thing with the container grown plants, as I mentioned earlier in tree selection, is they're in those black smooth walled containers, often held on less than hospitable site, which generates a lot of heat, which often stresses the roots. So generally, there's some root growth and health issues involved with container plants that we need to make sure that we take a look at prior to planting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the results from being container grown is the roots are confined in this area. So once the roots start expanding and growing out, they hit the container and they start growing in a circle. And therein lies our problem. So one of the first things we do is make sure that we knock the pot off of the root ball and take a look at the roots to look to see if there are some circling roots and girdling roots which are going to cause long-term issues, and I'm certain that you will find them. Container grown plants, as you see, this is one that I found in West Lafayette that did not have any type of root treatment in order to prevent these defective root systems. What we have is basically a continuation of that growth. We get poor lateral root symmetry. We don't get the roots growing out into its new home, looking for new resources as far as nutrition and water. We have fewer lateral roots, which are important for the stability of that plant, and an increased potential for tree death and especially tree failure, because those roots have not gone out to support the tree as it gets larger and heavier, and as a result, oftentimes they blow over very easy as a result of this poor root development. This is one that I pulled out that had died very quickly after planting, and you can see that the majority of that root system, especially those large lateral roots which are supposed to be expanding into the new soil, just kept growing into that circular fashion. Eventually it just girdles the tree, and as a result it either fails or it dies because of the poor root development. So what do? Now we want to talk about just good sustainable container installation. We'd have different size containers, different configurations, but typically it's really all the same scenario as far as that root treatment, which ensures good root development and expansion into the soil at its new home. So this is what we call either boxing or slicing the roots. And what we do is take a pruning saw, and I would recommend one that you're not going to use on trees because soil and saws typically don't do well. They dull them very quickly. But what we're doing, or what I'm doing here actually, is removing the outer inch or so of that root system. What I'm doing is essentially just pruning off those circling roots which are going to girdle the tree later on. You can see I'm cutting off the outer root system in all four cardinal directions of that particular container grown birch. Sometimes I will remove the bottom because some of those tap roots and early roots can actually hit the bottom and form a J and actually move back up into the container and exacerbate the problem even more. So again, it looks like you're actually just destroying that tree, but you can see that main lateral root there that I'll be pruning off a little later. But you can see that it's going to continue to grow in that fashion and not expand into the surrounding area. So that's the issue that we have there. So a lot of times also it stays within the confines of your planting pit, which means that's the only water resources it has as well. So you're not really destroying or hurting or damaging the tree. What you're doing is creating a more successful tree planting, especially with these container plants. All right, so now we've got our hole dug and we're ready to actually place this tree into its permanent location. Now we're talking about backfilling and what to do with that. Whenever possible, we want to make sure we use the existing soil. That is the best way to get that tree off to a good start and not to add a lot of extra amendments, supplements, and other types of products, especially fertilizer, in that process. Sometimes though, in urban situations, we may have to make some adjustments with some amendments, but those are special scenarios that require some additional information and probably professional assistance and guidance in order to determine what you really need to do to overcome those poor soil situations. We want to avoid any type of sand or addition of peat, compost, or humus. Oftentimes they can be more detrimental to the plant by either creating a more compacted situation or holding more water than we actually would like, which creates what we call a wet feet situation, as I mentioned earlier, as far as poor drainage. It's been proven that fertilizers are not appropriate during the installation process. There is no significant difference in adding fertilizer versus not. Oftentimes adding fertilizers at planting time can create a burn situation for the roots. And also remember, the tree is in the process of using its energy and resources to try to establish itself. So in that process, if we're adding fertilizers, that means it also has to use its energy and resources to metabolize that additional nutrition. So the best thing to do is to just use that existing soil, not add anything unless it's absolutely necessary, and save the fertilization till after establishment. And I typically recommend after 2 or 3 years. Gels and wetting agents have been also examined in this process as far as holding moisture. Again, I would recommend caution with that, or take it under advisement with somebody who understands the planting process in a little more detail, because again, they can create an over wet situation which can cause root problems. But there's a difference between amendments and modifications. Research indicates that amendments are not recommended. However, modifying the soil is certainly recommended and a good idea. Modification means you're changing the structure of the soil, and the simple act of just digging the hole, chopping the soil up into a nice fine friable mixture and placing it back in the hole is a great modification. We often find that urban soils and planting spaces around our homes or businesses are often very compacted, and just the fact of digging the hole and chopping it up and kind of removing that hard fragmented composition is actually better for the tree and actually helps it get off to a better start. So don't worry about the amendments or the fertilization. Worry about modifying the soil and getting it to a good texture so that we can remove those air and water pockets in the process of tamping it down. Now, some of the final touches we want to look at is pruning out any of those non-beneficial plant parts, doing some structural pruning. When I'm talking about non-beneficial plant parts, I'm talking about any suckers or perhaps any of those broken or damaged limbs, crossing branches, which may be found on those newly installed trees. We want to, as I mentioned earlier, want to make sure we tamp lightly or water in the soil as we're planting to remove those air pockets. And then, of course, make sure we remove any tags or strings that you see, especially around the root collar of the trunk, because they're typically made out of polyvinyl, which do not decompose, and as a result they'll just strangle or girdle the trunk and cause eventual death as a result of leaving those behind. And I still see that more frequently than I like. So make sure you remove any of that packing and transport material during the planting process. We've got our tree in the ground. We've successfully picked it, we've placed it, and we planted it. Now, what do we do afterwards? So, Wendy, do we have any questions or comments?
One thing I wanted to bring up, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, is with this new cicada emergence, that some of these smaller trees that we might be planting might be at risk. So I wanted to mention that I'm posting that or ask the expert on cicada emergence about that. And Lenny Farley talked about that and how to cover those trees and protect them. And also wanted to put a couple of things in, and you can mention this a little bit. How do we make sure structurally that it's going to be okay and that some windstorm is not going to take it out or something like that? Are there ways that we can support some of these smaller trees so that they're not, going to die before they have a chance to live?
Yeah, relative to the cicadas that we talked about, there's a couple of things we can do. One is not plant this year because of the brood X of the 17-year cicada. It's going to be a significant issue on some young trees. The ones that are existing can be netted to be protected. There's a lot of information on our website, and if you look up Purdue entomology, there's a lot of resources on that as well. I don't think it's going to be an impactful issue as far as significant damage, but it will. Some of the smaller newly planted trees, really small ones, small caliper, could be damaged. Relative to tree support systems, good segue, Wendy. We're going to get into that here in this next and final segment on post-planting care. Like I said, now we've picked our tree and we've planted it. Now, what do we do with it? It's kind of a responsibility. Planting a tree is actually taking care of it, and it's especially important if you want to protect your investment with that tree. Likely have spent a good deal of money getting that tree, and so we want to create a green asset rather than a brown liability by making sure we have good cultural practices and so forth to protect that. So we'll get into that next. So just a few quick tips on post-planting care regarding watering, mulching, and some of those other things that go along with creating a nice, sustainable, long-lived tree. Mulching does matter. Science has indicated that Mulching reduces evaporation, it improves moisture retention and moderates soil temperatures, it improves tree growth and survival, and also faster and better expansion of root development as it moves into its new environment. Make sure you use appropriate mulch, which is a good composted mulch, as typically hardwood or cypress. Pine needles can be used in certain locations, especially if you're trying to improve the acidic count in soils. One of the most important things that mulching helps with is protecting trees from mechanical damage. That is one of the biggest issues I see, especially in urban areas, is protecting from these guys that you see right here. And you know, they're moving at around these trees at 40, 50 miles an hour, it seems like, and they try to get as close as possible to those trees, and as a result, oftentimes they ding the bark, which damages the vascular system and creates a wound, which is future decay and risk as the tree grows. So mulch keeps any type of mechanical lawn equipment away from the tree, which I think is so important to protect it above ground as well as below ground. Now, as far as the mulching process for trees, we want to take a closer look at how the mulch ring actually is developed. We want to try to go out 2 to 4 feet from the trunk to make sure especially that we cover a little bit past where the installation pit was developed. We want to leave about a 1 to 2 inch gap so that we don't have mulch mounded up around the tree, and a taper downward towards the edge of the tree ring. No more than 2 or 3 inches is necessary. Any more than that and you could cause an adverse effect with mulching. So this is what the final process or project should look like after mulching. Again, the wider the better, because what you're creating is an improved environment for those roots to expand and develop into its new soil area. Some resources available to you as far as what we've just been talking about as far as the planting process, tree installation and practices from the education store, and also there's an accompanying video that goes along with the tree installation publication that shows a little bit of what I did as far as finding the root flare and also boxing and removing those stem girdling roots. A lot of science and research has gone into whether or not we need to add tree protection systems as far as trunk wraps or trunk guards, and also whether or not we need to provide any type of tree support system as far as guying or staking the tree. Well, that is very situational and dependent upon the environment that it's exposed to. So let's look at trunk wraps a little closer as far as what to do with them and the types of trunk wraps that we use. We want to make sure if we're going to use them or find it necessary on the site is that we use a white flexible plastic to make sure that the tree, as it expands, it doesn't create a girdling situation. Also, if it's perforated, even better, because it allows some airflow and doesn't create a moist environment behind that trunk wrap, which can increase the potential for insects and diseases. And the reason why I like the white flexible is oftentimes they're forgotten about, or people just don't know that they need to remove them. So the trunk wrap isn't fastened on that would create a trunk girdling situation which can damage or even kill the tree. It also does provide some sun protection. Often smooth bark trees can be damaged on the south and southwest side of the trunk as a result of the fluctuating temperatures in the winter. And again, it can be harmful if not adjusted on a regular basis, and create some issues, especially under these wraps that you see here that are fastened on, that create a very dark and damp environment, which can lead to degradation of the trunk due to decay. We want to make sure that we check those and not leave them on Typically, after the tree is established, anywhere between 1 and 2 years, those can be removed. Now, as far as tree support systems, I could spend a lot of time going over this, but I want to highlight just some important concepts regarding your judgment on whether or not you actually need them. They are necessary for stability. The key thing is that they are only temporary. 1 to 2 years max is all that you really need in order to allow that tree to develop stability by a developing root system. What we're doing is compensating for an underdeveloped root system until it gets established. It can also, in urban areas, reduce theft and vandalism, and also protects from mechanical damage. So those mowers and string trimmers tend to stay away from the hardware and structural equipment involved with tree support systems. If left on too long, they are prohibitive to good trunk development because the tree needs to move to develop good taper and additional wood fiber to make it more stable under extreme conditions. The rules of staking are 3. They're either too tight, too high, or left on for too long. And so there's additional information available for determining whether or not you need those support systems, and some considerations on how to choose the right one. Now, as I mentioned, extreme site conditions is where we really want to think about that, and usually under extreme wind conditions with a lot of exposure. On the left and then the middle picture, you see really what was an undersized root ball for that particular size tree. And you can see in the wind there, that's my water bottle, it's just wobbling back and forth. So the tree is never going to establish any type of root system or develop any type of stability. And staking or guying would have been appropriate there. As you see on the far right there, evergreens are certainly a good one to look at as far as creating supplemental support systems, especially on windy and exposed sites. Those evergreens are just a big sail that receive a lot of wind impact, and wind throw is very common, especially on evergreens. So those are the main examples of really the few reasons why you would want to stake or guy a tree. If you don't have to, it's best just not to do it. Oftentimes they're forgotten, and as a result we see the stem and trunk girdling to the point where they actually break off if we leave the wires on too long. And then even we need to remember to also remove the stakes or the T-posts that are involved in the staking system. This one actually grown into this maple completely and unable to be removed. So, you know, the concern here is not just the damage to the tree, but it also becomes a safety factor if kids want to play around the tree or climb it. So the best thing to do is just to carefully remove the top portion of this without damaging the tree, and then try to keep people away from it, unfortunately. There is another resource available to you on tree support systems, FNR 547, again available on the Purdue Education Store if you want more details on tree support systems and some of the considerations that go into that as well. Water is the single most ecologically limiting factor on a site. Water is necessary for the tree to grow and stay alive, especially newly planted trees. Frequent watering is important, but we want to make sure that we water as needed and water not on a schedule, but only as the tree requires it and based on environmental conditions. Remember, watering from our perspective is supplemental. If we have adequate rainfall, then it certainly isn't required. But most plants require about 1 inch of water per week. We want to make sure that we give it deep, frequent waterings at the rate of about 5 gallons per inch of DBH. So for example, if you have a 3-inch tree, then we'd want to give it approximately 15 gallons of water. But again, be careful not to overwater. Drainage is the key. Earlier in this discussion, I showed the overwatering and the issues it can cause. So get in there and check it. If you don't have a soil probe, you could just use your hand and just dig around under the mulch and feel the soil. If it's moist down below that mulch, then most likely you've got adequate water. And also pay attention to the leaves. You can see actually in these pictures, you see some chlorosis, which indicates that the tree is probably suffering from drought situation. The water bags are certainly good, or the gator bags. There's a couple of different designs of those. Make sure that you do pay attention to how frequently that they need to be filled, and also making sure that you are not leaving them on excessively long. Again, this is one of those situations where those bags can create decay and rot organisms to attack the trunk as a result. If the tree's been installed and cared for adequately after planting, then the tree should be good on its own and with just a few checks for watering later. All right, the last couple of things I want to talk about is actually pruning and fertilization, and I've alluded to this a little bit earlier. The only pruning we really want to do is remove anything that's been damaged during the planting process, but also we want to do some structural pruning to develop a strong central leader or strong dominant system and remove those multiple leaders and co-dominant branch structure that we often see in trees. But we only want to prune as much as we need to accomplish our goals here. Remember, if we're removing a lot of live green tissue, we're actually removing that tree's ability to generate food and energy resources for establishment. So we want to prune to promote good structure and good spacing and remove anything that's been damaged. That's the key things as far as pruning at planting. Now, we may want to establish a pruning strategy for that tree over the next 7 to 10 years during establishment, but that's another topic for discussion. Now, I'd like to end on fertilization. As I mentioned earlier, again, don't fertilize at planting. Oftentimes the tree's been fertilized a lot during the nursery production process. Fertilize 2 or 3 years after establishment with a good balanced fertilizer, only after you've conducted a soil test to determining if it actually needs it and exactly what the deficiencies are in that soil. So remember, fertilizing at planting can be damaging as far as new root formation, so it's best just to wait, let it get established, and then again, a fertilizing or nutritional program based on soil tests can be very beneficial to get that tree off and continued on a good start. So that pretty much covers in under an hour picking, placing, and planting a tree with some of the post-planting care tips. If you have any questions, again, those resources from the Purdue Education Store are available to you. Also, the Purdue Landscape Report can be found on Facebook. We also have a website, and it comes out every 2 weeks with new current and emerging issues regarding tree care, tree planting, tree maintenance, not just for the professional, but for anybody, landscapers, growers, homeowners, gardeners. It's good, timely information from a great group of professionals. And I mentioned the Purdue Education Store, lots of extension publications available to you. If you have your phone, you can take a picture of that QR code and it'll take you right to the Purdue Education Store. Just open up your camera and focus on the big square there. It'll take you right to actually Urban Tree Care, which is where there's a lot of information and videos on topics we discussed today. A lot of information on pruning and pest issues. So a wealth of information available at the Purdue Education Store. So thank you again for listening. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at Purdue University, Department of Forestry and Natural Resources for additional details and information. Thank you again, and be safe and stay well.
So thanks, Lindsey. We appreciate all the knowledge. And again, if you have questions from the audience and you're watching this in archive, go ahead and put those in our comment section on Facebook. And we will make sure that Lindsey answers those for you after the fact. But I guess a couple of things we want to cover. First of all, make sure what you're planting is appropriate for your environment. Check your soil first, right?
Yeah, I mean, right tree, right place. Gosh, we've heard that so much, but it is so appropriate. Because obviously we want trees to be there long after we're gone to provide those ecosystem services to our children and grandchildren, and we can make an impact on our environment, not just locally but regionally and globally if we all think about sustainable tree plantings. And as I mentioned, Indiana ranks 46th out of 50 states in air and water quality, and we really need trees to improve our quality of life and also our health.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say also that the invasive thing is really a real thing. I know a lot of people just think, oh, they just don't want me to plant a Callery pear, and they just don't like them, but they are causing damage. They are affecting some of the environments and habitats for some of our species around here.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is they just proliferate so much that they crowd out those more favorable ground plane natural wildflowers, and also crowd out the natural understory plants, which are important to our deer and mammals and birds. I just read an article in a science journal last week where actually the seed source from Callery pears, or these ornamental pears, are actually becoming injurious to songbirds and migratory birds because it's the wrong source of energy. It's high in sugar content. It's not giving them the nutrition that they need. So these invasives are far reaching. We're finding out more and more about them, and we need to be careful about our selections.
So don't ruin the birds' diets. Don't plant Callery pear. If you need
You're making
another reason, there
it
you
must
go.
be that the birds are just getting fat and can't fly far enough.
So once we have our tree selected, which if we need help with that, I guess that's the last question I had for you, is who can help me with that? I mean, is the person at the nursery going to be able to help me? Do I need to have the soil tested first? Do I need to have an idea of what I want before I go there? Are there people like you that can help me with that? Just who are some of those helpers that can make sure I don't do the wrong thing?
Well, first of all, by and large, unless you're in a really, really bad urban area, your soil's probably good enough to sustain good growth, healthy growth for your tree. As far as planting and the process and selection, if you go to a reputable nursery and garden center, yes, you're likely to have a better chance of getting the right advice. These big box stores don't have trained employees and that are educated in selection and planting. So also each county in the state of Indiana has an extension educator that can help them, or if not guide them to the proper resources. But I think one of the most underutilized resources that everyone in the state of Indiana has is the education store. And it's not just good for trees, it's also health and human services. There's so many things that are available on the education store, and if you just Google your topic like tree planting Purdue, you're going to get the right information that's current with best management practices and research.
Okay, we do have a question from Jerry about the ornamental pears, and this is not necessarily about planting but removal. He says, do you suggest stump grinding ornamental pears once cut down, or is just cutting down enough?
Stump grinding does help get rid of that root system much faster. You will have a lot of resprouts because remember, those underground roots are also underground storage mechanisms as well. And there's a lot of carbohydrates and energy stored in there, so they'll shoot up sprouts. So you will have stump resprout if you don't ground out that root system a little bit. But if you do have resprouts, and gosh, it's great if you can cut it down and replace it. But if you do have those stump resprouts, just take a little Roundup and spray it. If it's in turf, one of the best things to do is just brush it on with a paintbrush on the leaves, and that will translocate through the plant and kill it. It may take a few applications. Like I said, there's a lot of resources underground there that's going to keep going for a little while.
Well, Lindsey, I want to thank you for your time and certainly for sharing everything from soup to nuts for us. So if you have questions about what to plant, where to plant, when to plant, what to do after you plant, Lindsey is certainly available. He is our resident urban forester on staff, and so we utilize him a lot. If you happen to see someone climbing up in a tree somewhere, it might be him. But certainly want to thank you for your time, and we promised under an hour, and we are right at an hour. So we will resume FNR Ask the Expert in 2 weeks. We will be talking about pond aquatic plants with Mitch Ziske. So join us then. We'll have some promotional items in the meantime that let you know when and where about that, and get your questions in mind for that. So we'll go from the forest or your backyard to your pond in a couple of weeks. So thanks, Lindsey. And if you have questions, put those on Facebook and we'll get to them after the fact. See ya.
Bye.